I'm Dr. Natalie Beauchamp, and this is What the Heck, the podcast that dives into what the heck is going on in the world of health and well-being, explores how to optimize your mindset and your lifestyle, and shares practical tools so that you can achieve your fullest potential. Join me and a special guest each week as we discuss everything from biohacking to diet personalization to cutting-edge detox methods to setting and staying accountable to your goals. Ready to find out what the heck you can do to stay healthy, sharp, and at the top of your game? Let's get started. Hello everyone, Dr. Natalie Beauchamp here, and welcome to this week's episode of the What the Heck podcast. We have a lot to talk about today with a good friend of mine from Red Deer, Alberta, where it is colder than Ottawa right now, or actually today. Sometime it's colder for him, sometime it's colder for me. Dr. Mike Heinzlmeir will be my guest today, and we're going to talk about concussion. And what some of the misconceptions are with concussions, and then we're going to, talk about what this science is saying now, and some hacks that we can take to prevent. And believe me, because we're both in Canada, where there's a lot of snow and ice, concussion is not just for people playing sport. Believe it or not, a lot of people are falling. So we're not always expecting, to get injured when we're walking, or sometimes it's from car accidents as well. So I think doesn't matter if you don't play sport. I think this topic is really important. So welcome to the show, Mike.
It's great to be here now. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I'll just give a little bit of background about how we know each other, and then Mike, I'll let you tell your story and how you got to be a chiropractor in Red Deer, Alberta. We've known each other for 10 years now, and we are both together in an accountability call. And I think, if people are wondering what that's all about, it is just that, to make each other accountable to work towards the goal, that we set for ourselves. So I appreciate you being on the show, and I also appreciate your friendship that we've developed through all these years. So Mike, tell us a little bit more about your chiropractic story, and then, we're going to dig right into what is the research saying and the misconception, as I mentioned.
For sure. I'm excited to talk about this today, and I'm really excited to be on this podcast with you here today. I started in practice almost 14 years ago, and over the last 14 years, we've built this really cool practice. It started out with just my wife and I at the front, and we've built a multi-disciplinary team now, bringing a whole bunch of different angles together to help people out with their overall health and well-being. But part of that process, 4 years before I opened the chiropractic office, I was in a pretty bad snowboarding accident. Being from Canada with the snow, you learn to love and get along with it the best you can. And even though it is freezing cold outside today, I'm going to go snowboarding today as well. But what happened was I was going down the mountain and saw this park and this big rail in the park, and decided I was going to hit this rail, and caught it and didn't hit the rail quite right, and fell 5 feet and smashed in the side of my helmet and got knocked out cold on the snowboard hill. And what happened was I came around, and there's people standing around me. And the first thing I did was I stood up and tried to go down the hill a little bit more, and fell down and passed out again, and got back up again, kind of pushed anybody away from me for help, and went down the hill, pulled the board off, got a ride back to the place we were staying at the time, and spent the next 3 days in bed with a massive headache and kind of just trying to recover myself. And this kind of really demonstrates the story of everything that's wrong with concussion, how we handle it and how we understand it. I played hockey before too. And what used to happen with concussion was you'd have an injury and you'd go to the bench in hockey, or like I was snowboarding, and you'd wake up and say, you know what, I'm okay. I'm going to go back out and play. Or the coach would ask where you are, and you get somewhere half close to where you were actually at, and yeah, you're good. Go back on the ice again. So the understanding was that you're knocked out, you're back, you're good to go again, and so on and so forth. But what I learned after suffering the concussion 18 years ago was that it takes time for us to recover. And it's not as simple as just waking back up again and expecting your body to just recover really quick. One of the big misconceptions that we know about concussion in right now is that a lot of what we know came out of a 1997 research study. So this whole concept of the brain bouncing around in the skull and bruising on one side and on the other side, that's actually not what happens with a concussion. I want you to think about the brain like layers of like oil and water as they're kind of piled together in a cup. So if you pile those things together, and if you shake that cup a little bit, you get that kind of bubbling between the different layers. And that's just essentially what is happening in your brain with a concussion. So you've got white matter and gray matter in your brain. That's the different components that make up the brain tissue that we have. And the white matter is white because it's coated with fat. So it has a different density than the gray matter. So when we have an impact with our head and it shakes like this, you get a slipping of the layers. So the density changes between that. So kind of like you get that bubbling in the oil and water I talked about, you get this kind of shearing between the different layers of the brain. Now, on its own, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But what happens is if you take like a piece of spaghetti or a string and put it in between those layers of oil and water and you shake that, you'll see that it moves a little bit differently between the layers. Well, in our brain, we don't have spaghetti. Well, at least most of us don't. But what we do have is we have something called nerves that go between those two different layers. And there's one specific part of that nerve that goes between it called an axon. The axon in that shearing is damaged, and it creates this cascade of stuff that happens. And I can get into, I don't know how nerdy you want me to get today, but there's definitely some things that happen in there that create the symptoms that we see with concussion and the issues that we see surrounding the recovery from concussion.
Okay, well, I mean, we do have a bit of time. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper, I love the analogy actually. So if you have, other analogies like this to add to the equation, keep going.
Just keep adding to it. Well, I've got a few analogies after 14 years of practice.
Yeah, no kidding.
So one of the things that happens is with the axon, you've got this nerve flow that basically is going down the nerve. So it starts on one end. So it's like turning this garden hose on. You turn the hose on one end, and then the water starts flowing through. Well, the same kind of flow happens with the nerves. It's a little more complicated. You get some like different electrons like calcium and potassium coming in and out. And that's what makes like the electricity happen, because there's electric flow with the nerves. Well, what happens is when you get the axon damage, it causes a breakdown of basically the fibers in that. And then this flow of electrons in and out gets damaged. So the nerve's not really sure what it's supposed to do. So you get some of the stuff that's supposed to stay in the nerve leaks out, and some of the stuff that's supposed to stay out of the nerve leaks in. And it causes this kind of cascade of events. And so one of the things we see that happens with concussion is people get really tired after concussion. One of the reasons why is this kind of damaging of this electrons going in and out that aren't supposed to creates a deficit in this energy molecule in the brain called ATP. So ATP, if you just think about it, it's like a little energy thing floating around, and your body uses it to help sustain itself and help give you energy for different things. With concussion, it's interesting because your brain has a higher usage of it in the recovery process for it, but the part of your brain that makes that is damaged in it. So you get this energy deficit with concussion. And this is really what's happening in your brain with a concussion. So it's not just as simple as your brain being bruised and your brain having to recover from a bruise. It actually takes a little bit longer than what we think.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've been in practice for long enough. You've seen, like I have patients that, have had a concussion, and really like the impact wasn't that huge, but it's also the accumulation. And I think more and more people are aware of that, you get one concussion, you get a second, you get a third, and then it just, the impact can be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing. So can you speak about that? And also, as you touched on at the beginning, with sports, you're good to go back on the bench or go back on the ice or whatever sport it is. What's talked about now in the sports industry for the safety of players? I know it has improved tremendously, but if you don't mind talking about that.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a whole mouthful of stuff to kind of cover in here. So we'll go through kind of each component at the time, I guess. So when we have an injury to our brain, so say you're playing football and you have this big linebacker come and he tackles you down, and maybe he doesn't hit your head. Maybe he hits your body really hard. Well, we know now that the force of him hitting your body can transfer up through your spine into your brain and cause a concussion without it ever hitting your head. and without ever losing consciousness. So it's kind of two big misconceptions about concussion. Is you need a direct impact on your head and you need to be knocked out or loss of consciousness. And that's not accurate in either situation. It's common, but it's not completely accurate. And so once you've been tackled by this linebacker and you go to the sideline, you're like, I've got a bit of a headache. I'm feeling a bit nauseous. Some of the symptoms that we see commonly out of concussion. You go home, you take a little break from play. Well, we know it takes about 8 days on average for the symptoms of a concussion to go away. So those symptoms being, like I just talked about, headache, nauseousness, that vomiting feeling, some of that energy deficits, fatigue. And what happens is the symptoms go away, but all that kind of geeky neuro stuff I was talking to you guys about a little bit earlier takes a lot longer for it to heal. And so from day 8 to about day 30, which is when the brain actually heals from concussion, we have this really vulnerable window. And so if a player, and I'm talking about sports because it's the most common thing, but pretend you're in Canada and you're walking outside and you fell on the ice. So, non-sports related injury, and you have a concussion. Well, now you're outside, you're walking, and you slip on the ice again in that kind of 3-week window after the 8 days your symptoms are gone, and you hit your head again. That's when we see the real problems. So concussion on its own can be dealt with, and most cases of concussion will resolve at that kind of 30-day mark in terms of brain recovery. But if you hit that second stage like that, it can cause a lot of really big issues. And because of that kind of energy molecule I was talking about earlier, the deficit actually gets bigger. And that's when we talk about things like cellular death. And that's when the brain starts to die. And so it's really important that you let the brain recover properly beyond that window, and you need to do some proper testing to be able to understand what happens.
Yeah.
So,
and on top of that, some people are probably deficient in ATP to the brain to start with because of other metabolic conditions. So again, just add that to the equation. So I know you have 4 kids, Mike, and I know they all play sports. So have you seen a trend from, your oldest daughter being 13, 14 now?
yeah, she's 14 now.
14. And your son that's younger, like what's the trend and the education for parents out there in Canada anyway?
There's a ton of misconceptions around this as well. And the research is really non-supportive of a lot of things that people are currently doing for preventive concussion type things. So we can talk about mouth guards in sport, for example. There's really zero research that supports mouth guard use for reducing concussion injuries. There's really very little support to suggest that certain types of helmets will actually produce decreased concussion injuries as well. So like those are 2 really big things that we see because we always think about impact sports. So it's like, well, I'm going to get my child a better helmet. Well, they sell really expensive helmets, but they actually the research doesn't show that they're going to reduce your concussion risk. So that's kind of 2 things that we see on that side of it. There's a lot more awareness around concussions. After the Will Smith movie came out, the movie Concussions is what it's called. It's actually quite a good movie, but it created some awareness around concussions. It's not necessarily accurate either. There's a large discussion in that movie about something called tau proteins, which in the movie, it kind of alludes to the fact that repeated concussions can lead to this tau protein buildup in the brain, which can cause Alzheimer type symptoms. Well, we also know that protein builds up in athletes as well who aren't concussed or have no history of concussion. So I guess what we've really seen is more awareness around it, but there's less understanding of what's actually going on. And what we see is more people are actually, this is not the right word, but they're freaking out actually. So child gets a concussion. Well, there's this kind of really alertness to what's going on. And sometimes there's an overreaction to it. And then people are implementing things that can sometimes be harmful in recovery.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk. Great. My God, we could talk for hours on this, but let's dig into some of the protective action people can take. So I'm sure parents who have kids in sport heard, if they heard you about the helmet, they're probably thinking, well, what am I supposed to do here? So can you give us tips? And again, like we said, it's falling, it's getting in a car accident. You and I deal with patients with car accidents all the time. And, it's not that they hit their head on the windshield or anything like that. It's that impact and that jolt, that whiplash movement that can literally shake the brain. So what can people do? I guess we'll put it in 2 sections, Mike, with sports, if you do have kids in sport, and then, other types of injury, what can we do to not necessarily prevent, but deal with that as well?
Okay, so I guess when you look at concussion, a lot of things that you would do to normally keep yourself healthy, so things that you talk about in the Hack Your Health book, Hack Your Health Habits, a lot of those things actually play a really big impact in their prevention side of concussion. So what happens is when we are inflamed in our bodies, we know that the reaction from a concussion is much greater. So things that you can do to reduce any inflammatory response in your body are really important. So decreasing really high levels of omega-6 fatty acids, keeping your diet really clean, keeping your water intake up. Those are all going to provide some level of protective mechanism after the concussive side of it. But there's actually one kind of big thing on a nutrient side that you can do, and that's adding magnesium to your diet. Magnesium in that whole kind of neural pathway thing I was talking about earlier has actually been shown to prevent some of that electron exchange that kind of comes in and out the wrong way. It actually prevents some of that from happening, even in a concussed player. So that's one definite thing that you can do that's been shown through research to decrease your risk of having concussion. And if you've noticed, I've kind of steered away from using that severe, mild, moderate form because we know now that a concussion is a concussion is a concussion. There's not this kind of severe, moderate, mild diagnosing of it anymore.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something that you can do on that side of it, is just making sure that you are keeping your diet really good ahead of time, and adding some magnesium is definitely one of the protective things. Now, I'm not advocating for not using helmets or mouth guards. Obviously you want to keep your teeth and you want to keep your head safe from like getting hit from a puck. So, I mean, using helmets in sport and using mouth guards is obviously important for other reasons. I just don't want people to be confused into thinking that that's actually going to be providing a protective mechanism for concussion specifically. That's where that is on that side of it. And then those same things actually apply to non-athletes as well. So you're out walking around, making sure your nutrients are good, making sure you're keeping your inflammatory levels down in your body. There's definitely a general theme, the way you need to take care of your body outside of sport, whether you're, Joe Blow walking down the street or you're, Sidney Crosby playing hockey out on the ice. You need to do the right things right. And that's really what it comes down to.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about rehabilitation itself, because I know many of the patients that I'm seeing who have had concussions, either younger kids with sport or, like I said, car accident, they're being sent now to different kind of clinics for neuro rehab and so forth. So what's the success rate with those strategies? And what's the research saying, I guess, is what I'm asking.
With the research, well, let's talk about kind of the acute concussion and the post-concussion syndrome, because that kind of really fits into what we're talking about here. So an acute concussion is anything that's symptomatic within that kind of first 8 days before your symptoms go away. So if we catch people within that, we run through, like we call it, an acute concussion algorithm, where we start bringing them out of that concussion in the right way and testing and pushing the brain to make sure we're getting a proper recovery. Exercise is actually going to be a theme that you hear as I talk about some of this, but movement's really important, which is against what people normally talk about, which is this go home and sleep and rest. Anything beyond that 24 to 48 hour range of sleeping and resting really has no scientific benefit to it at all. And actually getting away from scientific benefit, talk about wearing sunglasses and staying away from screens. There's actually zero research to support those recommendations as well. So in fact, they actually show that wearing sunglasses after concussion can lead the brain to having light sensitivity after. And so you're actually creating more problems that sometimes then need to be addressed after.
Wow. So a lot of misconceptions out there, right?
There's lots of misconceptions, and it's unfortunate because a lot of the science is quite new. And in the allopathic healthcare model, it sometimes takes a while for that to kind of filter down into the treatment recommendations. And sometimes actually in other healthcare models as well. We've just been really lucky to be up to date on the most recent.
Treatment and teaching, right? We always say by the time something makes it to be changed in school books, in university, I mean, unfortunately, what people are being taught in school is already obsolete, but it just hasn't made it to the textbooks, right?
Yeah, exactly. So once you get beyond that kind of 8 to 10 day range of the initial symptoms of a concussion, we now consider anything after 10 days to be post-concussion. We start treating somebody at that 10-day mark as if they're post-concussion if those symptoms haven't gone away and the brain's not recovering at the level that we want to see it recovering at. And one of the key themes that we see happen with concussion is this: we see like a reduction in blood flow to the brain. And so this kind of damage that I talked about earlier on the neurological side of it seems to dampen some of the blood flow, and that dampens some of the oxygen exchange that happens within the brain itself. And so what we do is we actually run something, they call it a buffalo treadmill test. And to be honest, I actually hate the name of it, because the first time I thought of buffalo treadmill test, I thought of a buffalo like running on a treadmill.
That's what I thought when you said it.
Amusing thing. And then as I was learning more about it, I realized it was a test that was developed at the University of Buffalo. And that's why they call it the buffalo treadmill test. But what it does, it actually stresses people's heart rate and their oxygen exchange by like a walking pace, but adding incline to it. And one thing that's been really interesting is as you put people on the treadmill, you'll see their heart rate will start to spike, and you're measuring their heart rate every minute and you're increasing the incline. And then what you'll see happen is they'll just kind of hit one point, and all of a sudden the symptoms are just, they hit like a wall. And what we do is we measure where that's at, and then we provide rehabilitative training based on heart rate to that person. And then we send them out the door, they do the training, and then we actually bring them back through and retest them again. There's a whole bunch of other tests. One of the things that's really important about concussion is it's not just one thing that people have to test. Like lots of people do a SCAT test, or they'll do an impact test, and they'll call that like a baseline or an understanding of what's going on. But we know that you have to have like a multimodal, like a battery of tests that have to fit together. And then that has to filter into the treatment side of it.
Yeah. Is heart rate variability used in more recent testing, Mike?
There's some initial research coming out on heart rate variability, and it looks like there's going to be some really interesting components of that and how that filters in with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. But there's not enough research to substantiate that yet. But I think we're going to see it happen. For sure.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah. So I guess walk us through, that late stage that you're talking about. What would recovery or treatment look like for a person? And I know there's no one size fits all. We're not talking about that here. But what would it look like, and how can people benefit from that neuro training that I talked about earlier?
For sure. So there's different components, right? So I talked about the kind of blood flow component, but there's also this vestibular ocular component. So the way the eyes are tracking seems to lead to a lot of nauseousness. So what we do is we actually provide some like vestibular retraining exercises. Based on the testing that we do, we can actually figure out exactly the type of exercise that need to happen for the patient. And then we provide those. The other component that actually really fits into this, and this is actually really interesting on the chiropractic standpoint, is because of the G-forces needed to create a concussion, they're much, much higher than the G-forces needed to create whiplash. And the research is actually really showing that there's almost 100% correlation between having a concussion and having whiplash. And so what happens is once you have this concussion, we see this shortening of some of the muscle fibers that happen kind of in the back of your neck, so kind of up in this area here. We call it suboccipital triangle. And so there's actually some really good research that shows that if we start to really focus on that area, especially on the chiropractic side of things, that it can be quite helpful for pulling people out of some of the concussive type symptoms. A lot of the headache type symptoms are really formed in that area of your spine, and they really correlate back to the concussive side.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing this point up, Mike, because I say that on a regular basis when people say I had a concussion. I almost, always say, well, you also had a whiplash, because there's no way you would concuss your brain like this and not going through the force having an impact on your entire spinal cord, really. So
absolutely. Yeah, and the research really supports that. So that's kind of the three components we look at on our recovery side of it, is that kind of blood flow and the heart rate type training. We look at the cervicogenic, sort of the neck type retraining, and the rehabilitative care that goes along with that. And then the vestibular ocular care. So those things have to come together. And basically the algorithm that we use allows us to figure out where the patient needs to go on the care. And what it's allowed us to do is kind of work through some of these really complex cases that people have suffered for years with concussions, and help pull them out of these post-concussion symptoms, even years after they've had it.
Yeah, because you're right. There are some people that almost never get back to their normal. So that's great that more research is coming out, hopefully to help these people. So that's
right. And there's one other component too, Natalie, that's really important. is that we see that nutrition is actually a really important component of concussion recovery. And so there's some recommendations that come out of that. And one of them is taking curcumin, which is going to have an anti-inflammatory. It's going to reduce some of the inflammatory effects, but it has to be the right kind of curcumin. It has to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. And that only comes in a couple of really specific forms. One of them is curcumin, which is available from a company called Metagenics. They have that in an inflavonoid supplement. But if you buy curcumin that's just from a drugstore, it doesn't have that kind of process built into it to cross the blood-brain barrier. It's not going to provide you any mechanism of recovery. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we see is an omega-3 fatty acid, and it's kind of a controversial topic, or it can be, on the omega-3 side of it. But there is some benefit on that side of it, on concussion recovery. And then the other thing that we should talk about is creatine. Mm-hmm. So creatine helps with ATP regeneration. So that kind of energy molecule I was talking about a little bit earlier, it helps that brain recover from that and helps people pull out of that energy deficit or the fatigability that comes with that concussion recovery. Helps that brain start to heal up a little bit faster. So you add that in, and then you can add some vitamin E. And that's kind of the 4 components that we want to see on a rehabilitative nutritional side of things.
Yeah. Well. So I guess for people listening, if you have or have had some, incidents or concussion, or if someone has concussion, you really want to have them listen to this podcast, and also reach out to health practitioners that specialize in that, and not just, sit back and say, oh yeah, it'll get better on its own. It might, but we've talked about this cumulative effect and so forth. And the brain is just, every organ is essential in the body, but the brain is, controls everything in the body. So we really, really want to, make sure that we take good care of it. So thank you so much, Mike. We could talk for hours. If people want to reach you and find out more about your practice, and I know you're developing this concussion program right now, so there's going to be more stuff on your website for people to find out more about what you do. So tell us how we can reach you.
For sure. So there's actually 2 things we can do. The first thing we can do is you guys can go to our website. It's purereddeer.com. So purereddeer.com. And there's a contact us form on the website. Fill it out. Let us know what's going on. We're here to help people. And any question you have, don't feel like it's, silly or anything like that. We just want to make sure we're helping you. The second thing you can do is we're actually part of a network. It's called Complete Concussions. And so you can go to the website, completeconcussions.com. It's a worldwide network of 200 clinics that are involved in helping treat concussions. So you can go there, check that out. You'll see us listed on there as well. And that'll actually help answer some of the things that we've talked about here today as well.
That's awesome. So thank you so much, Mike, for the wisdom. I think you brought us up to speed with the research, and again, putting the awareness at the forefront, not to ignore those things and take good care of our brains. So thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed this today.
Thank you. So thank you so much for tuning in for the What the Heck podcast. This was Dr. Natalie Beauchamp with my guest, Dr. Mike Heinzlmeir. And until next week, where my guest is going to be talking about something very specific with health. And I'm going to leave you with this to pique your curiosity, so you're tuning in for next week's show. So have a great week, everyone, and I'll see you next week. I'm Dr. Natalie Beauchamp, and this is What the Heck, the podcast that dives into what the heck is going on in the world of health and well-being, explores how to optimize your mindset and your lifestyle, and shares practical tools so that you can achieve your fullest potential. Join me and a special guest each week as we discuss everything from biohacking to diet personalization to cutting-edge detox methods to setting and staying accountable to your goals. Ready to find out what the heck you can do to stay healthy, sharp, and at the top of your game? Let's get started. This has been a Wellness on the Go production.